It's been a while since we've done a big old detailed analysis of a classic move, and so I've got a pretty fine and famous one here, the almighty Piledriver. Historically, the most dangerous move in all of wrestling. The risks are large and the stakes are high, as someone's head's going to be between a person's legs and they're getting spiked right into the mat. For many years, the Piledriver was one of wrestling's deadliest moves. For those who used it as a finisher, it was largely the end of any opponent that they hit it on. In modern times, the status of the Piledriver, at least in its classic form, has varied at points. There's been times when it seemed as though the Piledriver was, well, just like any other move, similar to what happened over time with the likes of, say, the DDT or the German suplex. Happily, it's definitely pulled back some of its authority in recent years, although the evolution of the move, which was actually invented almost 90 years ago, means that there's been a hell of a lot of variations. Here we've got a whole bunch of Piledrivers to go through, whether they're those aforementioned variants or the more classical versions of the move. You may well get a sore head just from watching all of these moves in one go, so watch out. Anyway, we've got over 30 examples of head spiky goodness to go through, so let's get going. As just mentioned, the Piledriver, as a move, dates back to the 1930s, making it considerably older than the powerbomb, the last move we covered in this manner. We don't know exactly when the move was first used, but we do know who invented it. That would be a guy named Wild Bill Longson, who debuted in 1931 and popularised the move in the late 1930s. It's certainly possible that there were moves in catch wrestling, and possibly even sumo, that at least look similar or end in similar consequences to the Piledriver. Here, thanks to Catch Wrestling U on Twitter, are pictures of catch wrestler Barney Kosnick demonstrating such a move from the back in a 1940s training pamphlet, and even a 1920s illustration of sumo wrestlers that bears a bit of similarity to the Piledriver setup. But Bill Longson is the innovator as far as pro wrestling goes, and while there aren't too many examples of him executing the move on film, from what we can see, the Longson Piledriver has everything you would expect from a classic version of the move, lifting a bended opponent so that they're upside down, and then spiking them into the canvas, actually quite speedily in the Longson examples that are out there. Longson probably isn't too known outside of wrestling historians, and sadly there's not a whole lot of surviving footage of him in action, but he won the NWA title 3 times in the 1940s, holding the belt for a cumulative time of 1,935 days. That's around 5 years and 3 months, and the examples we are seeing here largely come from bouts he had against Lou Thesz. While Thesz's own original powerbomb wasn't necessarily a perfect version of the move, coming as it did after a struggle to lift Antonino Rocca, Wild Bill Longson's Piledriver is utterly recognisable as the move in every way, straight from the off. And so, having seen the origins of the move, we can now look at a whole bunch of other guys doing it, the excellent executors of the classic Piledriver. There's a fairly common theme that runs through the majority of Piledriver users that won't take too long to spot. The Piledriver, at least traditionally, is absolutely a heel move. Wild Bill Longson wrestled as an arrogant heel for his career, and the majority of classic Piledriver users did much the same, the sort of guys who'd only ever be cheered for on their home turf. Or, in the case of a couple of other wrestlers who are associated with the move, they previously wrestled as a face, but then added the Piledriver to their arsenal when they turned. Anywho, here's 10 or so good old-fashioned classic Piledrivers, with only a couple of slight variations, that'll take us from the glory days of the territories and right up to the modern age. There's a fair few wrestlers who've used a classic Piledriver as their finisher, to the point where it would be pretty tough to name them all, so we're kind of focusing on more famous faces. And it makes a lot of sense to start with the old Funker. Terry Funk used the Piledriver as one of his main finishers for virtually his whole career, and a Piledriver in the hands of Funk was almost always a guaranteed winner. It should be said that, even back in the 70s, it wasn't the case that anyone who used a Piledriver immediately got a win from it. Harley Race, for example, used the Piledriver quite a lot, but it was rare that he'd actually win a match with it, because it wasn't a finisher for him in the way that something like the diving headbutt or the delayed suplex was. Funk, on the other hand, pinned the biggest and best, including Race, with his piledriver, and it's a part of some of his most famous moments, hitting Ric Flair with one on the table in 1989 for example, a move that broke Ric Flair's neck. Well, in kayfabe anyway. Funk's piledriver, more a fall-in-one than a jump-in-one, is definitely one of his top moves. There's a certain flow to it that's hard to explain, but you would unquestionably be able to pick out Terry Funk's piledriver anywhere, even if all the wrestlers were put in SmackDown-style full bodysuits. It would be remiss not to mention Ray Stevens in this part of the video, another famous deployer of the move, and unfortunately someone who we don't have nearly enough footage of in action, particularly when it comes to his prime years. Like many of the folks in the first part of this video, Stevens was an all-timer of a heel, basically a textbook definition of the classic Territories heel, burly yet highly athletic, arrogant and sadistic, with platinum blonde hair that's virtually guaranteed to turn blood red once a match inevitably gets violent. He was also known as the Crippler, although he didn't actually get that moniker thanks to his usage of the piledriver. He got it thanks to his other favoured finisher, the Bombs Away knee drop, which he used on a tied up Dick Bayer's legs back in 1972. The piledriver is again part of a lot of Stevens' legendary moments, at least the ones that survive for us to watch today, a lot of which come from his brief but eventful run in the WWF back in 1982. No one was above the piledriver. Chief Jay Strongbow, in his 50s at the time, would fall victim to the move, and famously he turned on his one-time partner, Jimmy Snuka, almost as soon as he arrived in the Fed, piledriving Superfly twice on the concrete and making sure he left Allentown on a stretcher, with the result being a face turn for Snuka and a pretty bloody feud. All of this came pretty late in Ray Stevens' career. The guy debuted in 1951 after all, but this man was, in his prime, one of the absolute best wrestlers in the whole world. You can't do a video about piledrivers and not mention the kin. It's as simple as that. Jerry Lawler is an absolute master of this move. Prime Lawler hitting the piledriver is a thing of beauty, with his version being much more of a jump-in piledriver than the fall-in ones we've seen previously. His most famous piledriver is surely the ones that he hit on Andy Kaufman, but it's obviously a move that the kin's done hundreds of times. It should be said that another thing that really made the piledriver in Lawler's hands was his home territory, that being Tennessee of course. Nick Gulas's NWA Mid-America and its successor, Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association, or CWA, worked overtime to push the piledriver as an ultra-deadly move that could easily end a wrestler's career, helped along by invoking Tennessee's Athletic Commission, which had indeed legitimately banned the piledriver back in the 1960s. Lawler's use of the piledriver did a whole lot to push him as a majorly dangerous force in the territory, although the rules meant that it wasn't deployed willy-nilly in his prime. Largely it would be a move reserved for major blood feuds, because seeing as the piledriver would be an automatic DQ in a regular match, not that that necessarily stopped Lawler from using it from time to time, a no DQ match was virtually a guarantee that the piledriver was gonna be pulled out. On the other side of the coin, Lawler is kind of synonymous with the piledriver losing a fair bit of its lustre, although that's not really his fault. When he made his way to the WWF in the early 90s, he did kind of get turned into a comedy heel. He'd use the piledriver a lot, but it would almost never beat anyone outside of enhancement talent, and there'd even be various times where the move would just be completely no-sold, with Taz in 2000 being a famous example of that. I previously had an entry specifically for Paul Orndorff's piledriver in my favourite American finishers video, so obviously he's in here. Of all the classic piledrivers, Mr. Wonderful's is, well, it's just that. A picture-perfect example. The classic, arrogant heel's vicious piledriver. The stalling, the smiling as Orndorff happily stalks around with his utterly hopeless victim, the big jump, and just that little twist. The quarter turn that Orndorff always puts into the move that just really brings it home. As far as the traditional piledriver goes, I don't think there's any way that you can do it better than Paul Orndorff. He's the top guy as far as this move goes, at least when it comes to execution. Damn shame that he didn't win the WWF Championship with it, in all honesty. And also a damn shame that injuries plagued his career so badly. Still someone who I think is a bit underrated when it comes to wrestling and heeldom, particularly in the history of the Fed. Bret Hart didn't necessarily use the piledriver as a finisher. He certainly beat a few job guys with it in his earlier days, before the sharpshooter became his mainstay, but it's more just another weapon in his arsenal. Still, his piledriver has to be in here because, as with everything else he did, it's absolutely flawless. It most certainly could be a believable finisher for the Hitman, as it looks so devastating, with just about the perfect amount of height and snap to it, as well as some subtle touches, like always shifting his weight a little to one side when he does it, just to ensure his opponent's fully protected. You know, it's funny. I always associate Bret Hart's usage of the piledriver to the times when he was a heel, even though it is actually a move he used pretty much throughout his whole career. It just feels like it was a more prominent part of his moveset back in, say, 1997, like it was one of the things he added into his moves along with stuff like the ring post figure 4. That, and it also kind of ties in nicely with the endless feud he had against Jerry Lawler, thinking that, now he's a heel, he's using the main weapon of one of his biggest adversaries. In truth, I wouldn't be totally surprised if he actually didn't use the piledriver any more as a heel than he did as a face, and that Hart's usage of the piledriver was similar in a way to Harley Racer's. It's not a move that he feels he has to finish somebody with, it's something he does simply because he can, and it shows his mastery of all wrestling techniques. Similarly to Bret Hart and Harley Race, this next piledriver also isn't strictly a finisher, but once again, it's a move to be reckoned with. It's also our first Joshi entry, and it's Aja Kong. In fact, this is the first of 2 times that we're going to be seeing the Jungle Emperor here. Again, Aja Kong's deal is simply to dominate an opponent with a seemingly endless array of utterly brutal manoeuvres, lording it over the poor unfortunate soul every step of the way, and her piledriver is a perfect example of that. Of all piledrivers, Aja's one absolutely features the most stalling. She'll walk around damn near everywhere, perhaps throwing the odd knee to her helpless opponent, letting the moments last for exactly as long as she wants before planting them. It's a perfect piledriver for a dominant champion, the final boss of Joshi in the 1990s. And as mentioned, we will be seeing another piledriver variation for Kong a little later on, a famous one that she innovated, so she's pretty well spoiled for choice. It should be noted that, as good as this piledriver was at any time, the effect of it is increased tenfold when Kong's using it against her greatest adversary, Manami Toyota. The additional screaming that Toyota partakes in when she's trapped in Aja's piledriver predicament makes the whole thing feel even more brutal than it already is. On the other side of the scale from Aja's stalling piledriver, we stick with the women for our next entry. This one's for the snap piledriver, or the quick piledriver, or whatever you wish to call it. There isn't enough time to even get the victim's legs straight here. It's lightning quick, straight up and straight back down with all the stank imaginable. In modern times, there's 2 people who define this type of piledriver, the first being another all-time Joshi legend, the Dangerous Queen, Akira Hokuto. Once again, this snap piledriver isn't actually Hokuto's finisher, just one of many deadly moves that she possesses, but it certainly builds up well to moves like the Northern Lights Bomb, which unsurprisingly we're going to be seeing a bit later. Nowadays, one of the best female wrestlers out there does use the snap piledriver as a finisher. It's Timeless Toni Storm's main move, and she calls it the Strong Zero, or Storm Zero. She does a pretty damn good job of performing the move as well, and there's a couple of other people who do a decent snap piledriver. Chris Hero tended to use it quite a bit. On the whole, it's just a really damn satisfying move. We're finishing off the classic piledriver section with a couple of other slight variations, and good old Mick Foley deserves a spot here. While his piledriver finishes just like most other ones that we've seen already, there's a pretty big difference in the setup. Old Cactus prefers to lift his opponent up via their tights, making this a relatively quick version of the move, and also one that perhaps just has that added little bit of danger. Again, this pull-in piledriver, as it's often called, probably thanks to Aki's WWF games more than anything else, wasn't necessarily a finisher for Mick Foley, as he preferred the double arm DDT or mandible claw for that purpose, but it's still a nice version of the Piledriver with an unorthodox touch that is so very him. Our last entry in the traditional Piledriver section is another little variation, and it's the most obvious way to add a bit more impact to the move. To have a helping hand, someone jumping off the ropes to grab those legs and bring that head down even quicker than normal. The double team Piledriver, or spike Piledriver, has been used by a few tag teams over the years, from the New Age Outlaws to the FTR, but the first team that springs to mind here is undoubtedly Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard, it being the finisher that they used when they were the Brainbusters in the WWF. While they weren't actually in the Fed for all that long, they certainly managed to spike a few poor souls in that time, and they were pretty successful. The most famous example of this move being when they hit it on the utterly isolated and turned on Tito Santana to win the tag belts at WrestleMania 4. It would also make the odd appearance post-Brainbusters, and indeed post-Tully, in the hands of the Four Horsemen. In 1995, fellow Piledriver enthusiast Paul Orndorff was on the receiving end of a rather nasty spike courtesy of Double A and the Nature Boy. A simple variation, but an incredibly effective one. Okay, having had a big old look at the classic form of the Piledriver, we've now got a whole bunch more variations to get into, ones that obviously take the move into whole new directions. In fact, there's probably a fair few more variations on the Piledriver than you actually think there are. I've picked out quite a few examples that I felt were worth noting, not all, but definitely good uns, ranging from the most vicious of power moves to some pretty aerial feats, and they just go to show that there's a whole lot of different ways to plant someone's head into the canvas. We begin here with what is unquestionably the most famous Piledriver variation of them all. There is arguably no other move in the whole history of wrestling that fits someone quite so well as the Tombstone Piledriver fits the Undertaker. Say what you will, but it's clearly a match made in heaven. Or rather hell. Technically you would call a move a belly-to-belly Piledriver, or an inverted Piledriver, seeing as the opponents are round the other way, and while he's not the originator of the move, the Undertaker is synonymous with it. He's had a few different ways of executing it over the years. The classic one is of course a legendary and fluid move right down to the last detail, with Taker getting right on his tippy toes for that final stall before bringing them down. But his earlier Tombstone, which was often more like an over-the-shoulder move, does perhaps look that little bit more brutal. Yeah, there's some pretty nasty drops in the dead man's first couple of years. And of course, to really max out the brutality, there's the rare jumping Tombstone, the one that Taker retired Shawn Michaels with at WrestleMania 26. If you really want an exclamation point, well, they don't get a whole lot more final than that. Whichever way you slice it, a Piledriver video without featuring this move is obviously incomplete. But of course, there's a lot more to talk about than just Undy when it comes to the Tombstone. Indeed, Taker wasn't the first guy to use the move as a finisher in the WWF. That is, of course, Magnificent Don Muraco. Muraco's inverted Piledriver, for it didn't have the Tombstone moniker quite yet, is a little bit different from the classic Taker one, as again it's more of an over-the-shoulder affair, Muraco positioning the recipient like it's for a body slam, only instead he's bringing them down on the top of their head. If the Rock was feeling particularly spicy, and if it's a job guy, he could also execute this move with one arm. That is certainly quite outlandish, but we are talking about a fella who once famously ate a meatball sandwich during a squash match, so hey ho. There's plenty of other famous tombstones, of course. The move itself was apparently invented by Karl Gotch, although there's no footage of him doing it. However, he did apparently show the move to Andre the Giant, who is one of the earliest people you can see doing it, all the way back in 1972 against Stron Kobayashi. Andre's take is particularly vicious, a jump-in variation where the young giant gets a frankly ridiculous amount of air. I mean, Christ. There's a couple of famed British practitioners too, Dynamite Kid, and it was also pretty lethal in the hands of both Mark Rollerball Rocco and Fit Finlay. And then of course, there's Lucha Libre to think about. In Lucha, El Martinete can refer to any type of piledriver, but usually when we're talking about El Martinete, we refer to a Tombstone, although I believe that technically a Martinete Uno is a regular piledriver, while a Martinete Dos is a Tombstone. However you look at it though, El Martinete is by a long distance the most powerful move in all of Lucha Libre, and also the most illegal, being completely banned everywhere. It's the king of fouls. Which, of course, means it's a great move for a Rudo to pull out whenever they can. There are many legendary users of the move in Lucha: Abismo Negro, Universo 2000, Perro Aguayo, Art Bar, oh, and also Vampiro, who in 2004, in an absolute fit of pique, hit a jumping martinet on CMLL's plucky yet always horribly overmatched 2'6" mascot, Kemonito. Jeez, you thought Ultimo Guerrero's Kemonito kick was bad? It's nothing compared to that. Up next, the Cradle piledriver, or Gotch-style piledriver. Similar to a regular piledriver, but we've got a different grip, the old crotch lift, which should produce a bit more impact on the way down. A few people get their hands dirty with this variation. As I mentioned earlier, when Karl Gotch invented what was later known as a tombstone, he initially used the crotch lift position, essentially making it a cradle tombstone, and this is also what Dynamite Kid used. If it's a tombstone, naturally you're only putting the opponent in the crotch cradle when they're on the way down, as you can't exactly lift an opponent up for a tombstone this way. Jerry Lynn, meanwhile, mainly uses the regular sit-out piledriver version of this time simply preferring to slap on the cradle once he's got his opponent upside down, although he did use the cradle tombstone once or twice. Lynn's cradle piledriver is pretty cool, but I think the main man here has to be, of course, the Murder Grandpa. Minoru Suzuki's Gotch-style piledriver is the only one that really goes the whole hog, actually using the crotch lift in precisely the way it was intended. Misu doing this and going the full measure does seem to make the move feel a whole lot more devastating, giving it a little bit of extra bounce perhaps. Also, it would be silly not to mention Hiroyoshi Tenzan here. Tenzan also uses the Cradle Tombstone as one of his various finishers, calling it the Tenzan Tombstone Driver, or TTD. However, he has also broken out a special variation, the Ganso TTD, which is a sit-out cradle tombstone. Needless to say, that's bloody devastating. The regular sit-out inverted piledriver, or sit-out tombstone, is one of the more controversial entries here, mainly because, well, it is primarily associated with injuring people, and as such it's not seen a whole lot. I wonder why this is so much nastier and riskier even than the regular piledriver. Perhaps there's less opportunity for adjusting the recipient's position when the giver is sitting out as opposed to kneeling down. Anywho, the most famous instance of this move is, of course, Owen Hart hitting Steve Austin with it and breaking Stone Cold's neck in 1997. A move that, by all accounts, Steve Austin hadn't wanted Owen to perform in their match, but it ended up happening anyway. Austin himself, a few years previously in '92, had also played with fire on this move. He hit it on Masahiro Chono, that went wrong, and Chono ended up getting a stinger. When we've got top-level technical wrestlers of this calibre getting the move wrong in rather similar ways, it is perhaps little wonder why, even now, the sit-out inverted piledriver isn't really seen much. The package piledriver. Conversely to the previous move, the package piledriver, in which you folded your upside down opponent somewhat, trapping their arms, is surely one of the safer piledriver variations. It looks absolutely brutal of course, but we do appear to have a bit more control here, and the opponent does end up landing more on the giver's legs. So we've kinda got the best of both worlds, really. Undoubtedly, this move is mainly associated with Kevin Owens, who started doing it in the mid-2000s when he was Kevin Steen. KO's pretty good at it, of course, and he would eventually use it again in WWE. Still, the move was actually innovated by Aja Kong. The Jungle Emperor did it a few times, famously in one of her classic '95 matches against Minami Toyota, as well as an infamously savage squash of Chaparita Asari on War. There's a couple of little differences between Kevin and Aja's takes. Owens likes to butterfly the recipient's arms out, which Kong didn't bother with, and Kong, Well, she likes to spin it around a bit, because she's frickin' Aja Khan, and she's going to show just how helpless this poor soul is. A few other folks have used the package piledriver, and I should also throw in a special mention to Pentagon Jr. and his fear factor, especially when he does it as a running package piledriver, doing a little bounce off the ropes and a gallop forward before planting the opponent. Very nice indeed. We now come to one of the historically more controversial entries. There's plenty of ways to add some variation to a regular piledriver, and in the early 2000s, top independent wrestling scientists came up with a popular innovation to refresh the piledriver by performing a flip. And so, we get the flipping piledriver. Petey Williams is the man who popularised this move, giving it its common name of the Canadian Destroyer. Although he doesn't take the credit for its invention, he's given that to both his trainer, Scott D'Amore, and the Amazing Red. The Destroyer absolutely wowed the crowds when it was first seen, although it always had naysayers who felt that the move was just too much of a blatant cooperative act, requiring the recipient to flip along with the giver, essentially spiking themselves. As much as wrestling itself is a cooperative act, one where even the basics such as an Irish whip and subsequent rope run require a fair bit of suspension of disbelief, the Canadian Destroyer was a bridge too far for some, and it's generated a whole lot of flame wars and podcast minutes over the years. Nowadays there's all sorts of variations on the move. Running destroyers, super destroyers, counter destroyers, the Panama Sunrise. It's kind of just ingrained into the fabric of wrestling now, although I actually believe that the ubiquity of the Destroyer has, in a way, enhanced the standing of the classic old school piledriver. With that move now being rarely seen, it has a lot more intention behind it when it's used. There's more of a feeling that whoever's doing a regular piledriver does so because they really want to dish out some damage, and therefore the aura of the standard move has increased, partially because of the amount of variations there are of it, particularly this flipping variety. A special note should be put in here for a couple of other piledrivers that have also had a bit of flippage attached to them, primarily double team ones. The Young Bucks Meltzer driver adds a blatantly and mockingly unnecessary springboard flip to a spiked Tombstone, but it still undeniably makes the move appear even nastier than it ordinarily would be. Moving away from the land of flips, we've got two similar yet different variations, both of which fall into the category of scoop piledrivers, something that starts off similar to a body slam but ends with a head getting driven into the mat. First, here's a move that has become pretty ubiquitous, performed by a whole lot of people. Still, as the name suggests, it's pretty easy to trace it back to someone. The Michinoku driver, to be more accurate about the name, the Michinoku driver number 2, was of course created by TAKA Michinoku in the 90s, and while it's not necessarily thought of as a piledriver variation, it is part of the family. After all, you do end up sitting out and planting the opponent on the back of their head. This move doesn't necessarily shine on the brutality front, but it's a gloriously fluid thing. The pickup, the slam, and the resulting pin comes together as one seamless sequence, and as much as the Michinoku driver's been used a hell of a lot, and not always as a finisher, it still brings a smile when it's done right. And if you do want to up the brutality factor, well, how about an inverted scoop piledriver? Same move for the most part, but you start with the opponent's back to you. This is, of course, Chuck Taylor's Omega driver, or Awful Waffle, and it ends up being a lot more head spiky than the regular Michinoku driver. Absolutely fantastic move, that one. The other scoop piledriver here is one where the opponent gets dropped to the side rather than between the legs. In other words, the Northern Lights bomb. Again, many wrestlers have used this move, but this entry's really only for one person, and that's Akira Hokuto. She innovated this manoeuvre, and no one does it remotely close to how she does it, not even her husband. While both the Northern Lights bomb and Michinoku driver set up with a scoop slam, there's a slight difference in how a scoop slam is set up when it comes to Joshi. Usually someone like Hokuto will put the opponent's arm over their head first, almost like it's going to be a suplex rather than a body slam. With this in mind, it's more natural for a Northern Lights bomb to finish to the side rather than between the legs. And oh boy, when Akira Hokuto does it, it's basically a freaking spike, while still being a very smooth move. Wonderful stuff. Oh, and there is a nasty inverted version of this one too. The inverted Northern Lights bomb is also an Akira Hokuto innovation, and she calls it the Witchcraft. Because clearly, her regular Northern Lights bomb just wasn't quite brutal enough. Another move that's not necessarily thought of as being a part of the Piledriver family, but most certainly is the Air Raid Crash, although as we'll see this move has a lot of different names. Technically, at least going by Wiki, this is an over-the-shoulder, back-to-belly piledriver. Lift the opponent up so their head's facing your back, lock that head up with your arm, and then sit down, driving the head into the mat. Generally, if a move's impact centres around driving the head, it can be considered a Piledriver variation. We've got lots of examples here. Depending on where you grew up and what you watched, the first name for this move that springs to mind could be the Air Raid Crash, but it could also be the Kryptonite Crunch, it could be the Schwein, the Celtic Cross, the White Noise, the Reality Check, the Black Mephisto. Generally speaking, credit for the move should probably go both to Nova for the Kryptonite Crunch and to Mariko Yoshida for the Air Raid Crash, as they are actually slightly different. In the Kryptonite Crunch, everything happens on the same side. You lock in the opponent's head with the arm that's on the side you've got them draped over before taking them down. In the Air Raid Crash, you actually drape the opponent across your back, locking up the head with your other arm. If they're over your left shoulder, you lock the head with your right arm. It might be confusing how I'm explaining it, but seeing the two moves back to back does a better job of showing the difference. Both of them are popular. Shima's Schwein and Mike Modest's Reality Check follow the Kryptonite Crunch, while Finley's Celtic Cross, Sheamus's White Noise, and Taichi's Black Mephisto follow the Air Raid Crash. We've got another over-the-shoulder move next, and another variation of the Piledriver that's relatively safe, although this may be the last one before we start to get to more extreme examples. This is the Fire Thunder Driver. Technically an over-the-shoulder sit-out tombstone or reverse piledriver, one where the recipient's head ends up between the legs. Another move that's lovely because it looks nasty as hell, but again the taker's head, so long as it's done right, never really ends up getting close to the ground. The likely innovator here, and most certainly the person who gave the move its common name, is Mr. Gannosuke, who used it back in FMW in the mid-90s. But there's a lot of other folk who've taken this for their finisher. Bam Bam Bigelow used it as the Greetings from Asbury Park, Rikishi called it the Rikishi Driver, Ray Phoenix simply calls it the Fire Driver, Mike Krakenbush has got a rather nasty variation where he crosses the opponent's legs, that's called the Kraken Driver 2, and others who use the move by its original name include Thunder Rosa, Gunter, and Tomoki Honma. It's a pretty common move, but a damn good one, and still one that's a perfectly effective finisher, nearly 3 decades after its creation. Sticking with the over-the-shoulder theme, you've got the regular back-to-belly piledriver. You crouch down and hoist both of your opponent's legs over your shoulders, leaving their head pointing down to the ground, the belly draped over your back. From here, there's several different ways that you can go. First, there's the kneeling way, in which you land on your knees, obviously. This move is the axe guillotine driver, and it was innovated by Takeo Omori, although nowadays this move is more famous in the hands of Handman Adam Page, who calls it the Deadeye. Slightly nastier is the sit-out variation of the move. Same thing, but, well, you sit down instead. Ouch! This variation originally belongs to another Joshi legend, this is Bull Nakano's Bull's Poseidon, although it's also famously used by Genki Horiguchi, who calls it the Beach Break. You can also see this in the hands of Orange Cassidy. Finally, we have the Sunset version, similar to the kneeling version, but first you hook the opponent's legs under your arms before dropping to your knees, meaning that on impact they're immediately trapped in a pinning predicament. This is what Trent Beretta calls the Crunchy, and it was also used previously by indie wrestler Jigsaw, who called it the Jig and Tonic. One rather unorthodox position, 3 different yet thoroughly righteous wrestling moves. Isn't it fun? Now we're getting into some really quite vicious variations, and we start with another over-the-shoulder move that belongs to the legendary Mitsuharu Misawa. Now some may perhaps expect a Misawa entry here to be about the Tiger Driver 91, but technically that's a powerbomb variant. Whereas his Piledriver variant, well, that's the Emerald Flowsion. Innovated in 1998, this move is a fair bit like a Tombstone, only Misawa takes the opponent down on his right side, making for an altogether nastier impact on the head and neck. It took a fair bit of time for anyone to kick out of this move once he started using it as his main finisher. And then when some of his biggest rivals did start kicking out of it, well, he went one step further and created the Emerald Flowsion Kai, a side tombstone that's initially set up like a vertical suplex, meaning the drop is altogether higher. Needless to say, nobody ever kicked out of that one. A couple of people have adopted the original Emerald Flowsion in the passing years. Samoa Joe called it the Island Driver, and Gunter calls it the Last Symphony. As for a Tiger Driver that unquestionably is a pile driver, we've got to include the Tiger Driver 98 here, essentially a butterfly or double underhook pile driver. The move got its common name in 1998, obviously, when it was used by indie wrestler Excalibur, although the move actually goes considerably further back than that, being used by Joshi wrestler Yukari Omori in the mid-late 1980s. Still, it's had a lot of other names and a lot of different practitioners. Kid Cash called it both the Bowit the Bar and the Moneymaker, Josh Prohibition called it the Drunken Driver, Josh Alexander calls it the C4 Spike, others such as Kenny Omega and Cody Rhodes have also deployed it. Nowadays, however, rather than Tiger Driver 98, you're probably likeliest to hear it referred to as the J Driller, in tribute to another one of its foremost users, that being the late great Jay Briscoe, who started using it as his finisher in 2001. The Briscoe brothers would also often team up to perform a Spike J Driller, which, needless to say, isn't a move that anyone was likely to kick out of. It shouldn't be forgotten as well that the legendary Jaguar Yokota used a butterfly pile driver, and hers was a kneeling variation. No one's next likely to forget that one. Another entry, and another move that has its origins in Joshi. Here we have Megumi Kudo's Kodomi Valentine, another one-to-hook pile driver, although this is a back-to-back pile driver, with the poor recipients laid out entirely over the giver's back before being brought down. A devastating and indeed quite risky move, definitely one of those where you really have to make sure that you've sufficiently tucked your chin. This move's proved quite popular over the years, with a few other folks using it. Shane Helms called it the Nightmare on Helm Street, as well as the Vertebreaker, which is also what it's called when Cody Rhodes hits it nowadays. But outside of Kudo, the move's most famous practitioner is undoubtedly Homicide, who calls it the Cop Killer, or Gringo Killer when he was in LAX. The notorious 187's version also has a very rarely seen yet utterly disgusting double team variation. When he and Low Key teamed up, a couple of times they used a combination of Homicide's Cop Killer and Low Key's Ghetto Stomp. Horrifyingly risky? Undoubtedly yes. Unbelievably freaking awesome? Also yes. We had a sort of suplex pile driver in the shape of Mitsuharu Misawa's Emerald Flowsion Kai, but the full-on vertical suplex pile driver experience? Well, that belongs to the big bad booty daddy. The Steiner Screwdriver is one of the most infamous and spectacularly vicious super moves of them all. It's the nature of the Steiner beast that he has many different ways of finishing opponents, but none are nastier than this, with Big Popper delaying it as much as possible, up in the dread before bringing someone down headfirst from a very great height. In truth, it's amazing to think that apparently nobody got injured taking the SSD from Scott Steiner, but apparently that is the case. It finished a fair few big matches for the Steiner brothers, and a couple of others have also used the move. Brian Cage, a rather Steiner-esque monster himself, calls it the Drill Claw, and even Scott's brother Rick used it at least once. Scott himself did develop a somewhat safer way of performing the move in his later career, slightly toned down and perhaps closer to an inverted pile driver, but still pretty damn nasty. The Kawada driver, which I ultimately decided not to fully include here as it's in the Powerbomb vid, is a move that exists in something of a grey area between Powerbomb and pile driver. You could after all class it simply as a kneeling pile driver, although it was by all accounts originally conceived as a Tiger Driver 91-esque sheer, and I do mean sheer, drop powerbomb. There is, mind you, a rather similar move that most definitely belongs in the pile driver category. the quickest piledriver of them all, and absolutely one of the most lethal, to a point where you're not likely to see anyone else but this guy perform the move, and he is not likely to do it again. This is AJ Styles, and this is the hollow point. This is for when the phenomenal one quite simply wants to absolutely destroy someone, and he only did it when he was leading the Bullet Club. You think that AJ's going to lock someone in his traditional Styles clash, but then he just drops to his knees. Bang! From there, AJ holds on to the now limp victim, and the ensuing Styles clash is just a fait accompli. The opponent's already completely done, but AJ simply is finishing the sequence. This is the sort of move that, to be honest, you'd only really trust someone like AJ Styles, a man whose technical prowess and execution is virtually unmatched, to do. Someone who has so much poise and control that he can do a move like this without just flat out breaking a person's neck. It's as virtuosic as it is vicious. Up next we have 4 horrifying variants, all from the same wrestler. A series of absolutely disgusting creations. It's Super Dragon's Psycho Driver. First we have the original Psycho Driver. This essentially is a torture rack pile driver. Kinda similar to Kenta Kobashi's Burning Hammer, but while that is technically another sheer drop powerbomb, this ends with the opponent's head getting planted between the legs, thus singling it out as a pile driver variant. Super Dragon first used this move in 2000, and in the following year he created the Psycho Driver 2, a similarly nasty outcome, only this move starts in a pump handle position. Jesus, and indeed, Christ. Much like any line of popular two-door hatchbacks, Super Dragon seemed to enjoy iterating on this move annually, bringing out a new entry with each passing year. 2002 brings us the Psycho Driver 3, which is similar to the original Psycho Driver, only this time a cutthroat is applied to the opponent's neck, meaning that, well, you've just got nowhere to go, have you? Someone should perhaps consider calling 911. Finally, in 2006 we had the ultimate horrific creation, the Psycho Driver 4. This wasn't seen much, but it starts with the torture rack, and from here Dragon brings everything together. He clutches his wrist, bunching up the opponent before dropping them. Good God Almighty. I think this may have only been done once, but it won Dragon the CZW Heavyweight title in 2006. When you consider as well that Super Dragon has done this move onto chairs, onto tables, off the apron, onto just about anything, and that there's even a freaking double team version that happened when he teamed with the Young Bucks, yeah, this move is way up there. You will not find many piledriver variations deadlier than this one. There's only one way to beat something like the Psycho Driver. We have to go into the corner. We have to go super. Now, it's simple enough to make a move nastier by going up the turnbuckles, and the piledriver is not an exception. Rhino's frequently done a piledriver from the second rope, calling it the Rhino Driver. Just Incredible also occasionally performed his Tombstone, that's incredible, from the second rope. Perhaps most viciously of all, Mitsuharu Misawa won his final Noah GHC heavyweight title thanks to a Super Emerald Flowsion, which you would think would surely take the biscuit. But no. I think the nastiest, most brutal looking and just flat out carnage-tastic piledriver variation has to be Manami Toyota's Victory Star Drop. The technical term for this is apparently, according to the old wiki, a backflip piledriver, which in text just simply can't be envisioned. But it sees Toyota, with her opponent on the top rope, facing out, perform a body scissors and dragging the opponent down, landing them on their head and neck. Really, in fact, landing both of them on the head and neck. This move is absolutely crazy. It's like you're doing a hell of a lot of damage to yourself just to do as much as is possible to the opponent. It worked for Toyota, of course. The Victory Star Drop pinned some of Joshi's greatest. It won her the red belt against Aja Khan, which I suppose in a twisted way shows just how much winning that title, the most prestigious in all of Joshi Pro Res, meant. That you would be willing to do something this wild to get it. It is a frickin' amazing move, but good lord. Very few people have ever tried to recreate the Victory Star Drop. Most people understandably wouldn't dare to recreate it. the intricacy, the risks of something going wrong. I mean, talk about having nowhere to hide. However, one other Joshi star wants to mention here, that being Azumi Hyuga, one of the greatest of Joshi's dark ages in the mid-late noughties. She also used the Victory Star drop, and in 2006 she actually used it against Manami Toyota herself, helping her to secure a famous victory. An incredible move, but certainly not one for the timid. Okay, so we're finished covering various piledrivers from pro wrestling, but we're not quite finished here yet. Why? Well, there's a fair few piledrivers of note to be found in video games. It's certainly a move you'll find in the hands of various virtual wrestlers or other powerful hombres. Indeed, a couple of video game piledrivers are just as famous as any other real-life wrestling piledriver you could mention, so it would actually be a bit of a flub to leave them out. And so, as a little bonus, here's a few favourites. First up, well, how about everyone's favourite wrestler come mayor? 1989's final fight sees Mike Hagar and friends clean up Metro City, and Hagar himself's got a couple of wrestling moves that he can use to take down the Mad Gear. He's got his crowd-busting spinning clothesline, of course, a decent German suplex, but the most satisfying and most damaging one is certainly his jumping piledriver. You grab an opponent, take a big old jump up, and spike them. Indeed, you spike them so hard that any other thug in the vicinity is also going to be knocked over by the impact. Very nice indeed, and this is something that Capcom would evolve further. While Hagar himself never appeared in Street Fighter II, the almighty Russian Zangief took the mantle of being that series' resident pro wrestler. As mentioned in the last video, he was directly modelled after the real-life Viktor Zangief, who was part of New Japan's Red Bull Army. Zangief does use pretty much all of Hagar's moves, including the spinning clothesline and regular jumping piledriver, but he's got something even bigger. A full circle of the joystick and fierce punch results in the spinning piledriver, with Zangief grabbing the opponent, jumping impossibly high up, and utterly crunching them for huge damage. It is thoroughly appropriate for the man, of course. Zangief is the most lethal close-range fighter of them all in SF2. He's got a whole ton of grabs and throws to punish opponents with, and this one is especially vicious. It gets more extreme in later Street Fighter games too, when it becomes a part of his final Atomic Buster, ruining opponents with a mix of his Atomic Suplex and Flying Powerbomb before finishing them with a spinning piledriver. Or two. Naturally, you're going to see plenty of piledrivers in actual wrestling games. That kinda stands to reason, and it would perhaps be silly to cover every appearance the move's had in wrestling games. There's a couple that definitely stick out to me, mind you. First off, from the most perfect arcade wrestling game of all time, there's the piledriver from WWF WrestleFest. The piledriver here isn't anyone's finisher as such, it's only used by two wrestlers, that being Big Boss Man and Animal, and it usually happens when an opponent's starting to run on empty. It's often the move before the special move, and like everything else in WrestleFest, it is beautifully animated and satisfying as all hell. Just the right amount of height to be a lovely, exaggerated version for arcade purposes. Very nice. Lesser known, but also a favourite of mine, is the jumping piledriver from Sega's 1989 game Wrestle War, a somewhat middling game that I do have a bit of a soft spot for. Our hero, Bruce Blade, after stomping an opponent to hell, can finish them off with a whopper of a jumping piledriver that goes all the way up, or off the screen on the Mega Drive, before landing with a metallic crash. The pin is academic once you do that, although do be careful. The same move can happen to you if your energy gets too low. Finally, we go fully outside of wrestling for two outlandish and classic moves that are still most definitely piledrivers. If you're in video games and you're a ninja, chances are you've got a very cool driver in your arsenal, the Izuna Otoshi or Izuna Drop, which I believe loosely translates to Weasel Drop. You grab an opponent, take them right up into the air and flip them. Both you and the victim point to the ground, but it's the other guy who's going to end up with a broken neck here. The Izuna Drop has its origins in manga, specifically Sanpei Shirato's Kamui series from the 1960s, in which the titular character got his inspiration for the move by watching weasels leaping from trees and bringing birds to the ground, but it's been a regular part of various video game ninjas' repertoires, often with some extra spin attached. I always associate it with Ryu Hayabusa, who's used it ever since going 3D in Dead or Alive, but there is an absolute beaut of a video that goes through damn near everyone who's used the move in montage form that I'll link to in the description. Finally, and somewhat similarly to the Izuna drop, we go to RPG land for a mimetic gem from Final Fantasy VI. Sabin's Blitz Meteor Strike, often simply referred to as a suplex, kind of fits in with the Izuna family as, again, it involves jumping high up with someone and flipping them upside down. All pretty cool and that, but the move achieved legendary status simply because Sabin was, perhaps through an oversight, able to perform this move against a frickin' ghost train. I say oversight as usually, Sabin can't use this move against a boss, it simply won't work. Except for this one, where he jumps ridiculously high and flips a frickin' train upside down. A quite glorious moment, one that FF fans have been absolutely adamant should remain exactly as is in various remasters of FF6 over the years. And it's certainly something to put an exclamation mark on this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look back at all different kinds of Piledrivers, whether factual or fictional, and I'm sure that there's other legendary moves that I can also look back on in this way. But until the next time, take some remedies for that sore neck of yours, and bye for now.